$307,000, 41.9%, $9.9 trillion. What do all of these numbers have in common? In this video, I'm going to talk about a question relating to these numbers that's on a lot of our minds. So here's the question: is the real estate market going to crash? So back to the numbers: 307,000, 41.9%, and $9.9 trillion. So stay with me and I'll tell you why these numbers are so important. Let's start with the term we all know and love, the American dream. Historically, owning a home has been pretty synonymous with achieving that dream. In a recent NAR poll, over 86% of buyers agreed that home ownership is still the American dream. So here's a little backstory on how that phrase came about. So before the 1950s, less than half of the country owned their own home. But after World War II, many of our returning veterans used their benefits from the GI Bill to purchase a home. And since then, the percentage of home ownership has continued to increase to about 65.5% in the United States. So that strong desire and demand for ownership is what has kept home values appreciating ever since. So here's a graph that shows price appreciation since World War II. So you can see in this graph that since World War II, the only time that home values ever really dropped significantly was during the housing boom and bust, which we all remember in 2006, that went on to about 2008. So our current spike in prices over the last 2 years looks a little like the spike prior to 2006. And it looks and feels a little bit too familiar. So no wonder folks are getting a little bit concerned. But let's take a little bit of a closer look. Let's look at then and now, and maybe that can tell us what the cause of the crash back then was. So back in 2006, we know that there were a lot of foreclosures on the market, and that drove down all of the home values. So there were two main reasons for all of those foreclosures. Many purchasers weren't qualified for the mortgage they got. And the second reason was many homeowners were cashing in on the equity in their homes. And so when those home values dropped, they found themselves in an underwater situation where the home wasn't worth as much as the mortgage that they owed on the home. And so a lot of them had to walk away from their homes, creating more foreclosures and continuing to lower the neighboring home values even more. So we all know this cycle continued for too long, for years. The question today is, it feels the same, but why is it different? Here are the two reasons that today's market is really nothing like the one we experienced 15 years ago. Number one, today, demand for homeownership is real. It's not artificially generated. So we know that running up to 2006, the banks were creating artificial demand by lowering their lending standards. And they made it a lot easier for just about anybody to qualify for a home loan or to refinance their current home. So today's purchasers and those refinancing a home are meeting up against much higher standards from mortgage companies. They did learn from their past mistakes. So here's a graph from the Urban Institute showing the amount of risks banks were willing to take on then as compared to what they're willing to take on now. So there's always a risk when a bank loans money. However, leading up to the housing crash 15 years ago, lending institutions took a much greater risk in both the person and the mortgage product that they offered. And what that did was lead to a lot of defaults, foreclosures, and falling prices. So today, the demand for home ownership is very real, and demand during the pandemic just increased more. And in addition to all of that, today's lending standards are much stricter in the current lending environment. Purchasers can afford the mortgage they're taking on, so there's not a whole lot of concern about possible defaults. And if you're worried about the number of people still in forbearance, you should know that experts say there's really no risk of that causing an upheaval in the housing market today. And experts predict that there won't be a flood of foreclosures. And we'll explain that a little further later on. So the second reason this is not like before is people aren't using their homes like ATMs. like they did in the early 2000s when prices were rapidly going up and it was great and many thought it would never end. So they started to borrow against their equity in their homes because they had a lot. So they wanted to finance new cars, boats, vacations, really whatever. And when prices started to fall, many of these homeowners found themselves underwater where they owed more on their home than the home was actually worth. And this led again to a lot of them having to abandon their homes, increasing the number of foreclosures and defaults. So we haven't forgotten those lessons. As prices have skyrocketed over the last few years, it's in the back of our minds. So Black Knight, which is another data reporting institute that keeps track of these things, reports that tappable equity, which is the amount of equity available for homeowners to access before they hit their loan-to-value ratio, which is about 80%, that has more than doubled compared to 2006. In 2006, it was $4.6 trillion, and now it's $9.9 trillion, and that's one of those important numbers I mentioned at the top of this video. The last report from CoreLogic tells us that the average homeowner gained $55,300 in home equity over the past year alone. And in my state of Oregon, the average gain was $66,000. In this slide, you can see that Deputy Chief Economist at First American says that homeowners in Q4, quarter 4 of 2021, had an average of $307,000 in equity. So that is a historic high. And another data service also reveals that 41.9% of all mortgaged homes in the United States have at least 50% equity. So these homeowners, because of their equity, won't face an underwater situation even if prices do dip slightly. So today's homeowners are much more cautious. So remember those numbers: $307,000, 41.9%, and $9.9 trillion. What do all of these numbers have in common? Equity, equity, and more equity. Those are the major reasons that the housing crash of 15 years ago isn't what we're dealing with today. There was a tsunami of foreclosures, and with much stricter mortgage standards now and historic levels of homeowner equity, according to the experts, the fear of massive foreclosures impacting today's market isn't realistic. So thanks so much for watching, and be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. And if you're thinking of buying or selling a home, grab one of our free buyer and seller guides. You can click right above there and access it, no obligation. And if you have any questions, you could always reach out or visit our website for more information, and I'll put the links below. And I will see you in the next video.